To the Police Commissioner, what criteria is applied to determine the involvement of the Police Fixated Persons Unit in any matter?
I'll take that question first, sir, and I'll pass over to Mr. Walton, who's sitting next to me, who oversights that unit.
Okay.
But there is a criteria and a protocol and a form of assessment through the intelligence, terrorism intelligence section of the Counter-Terrorism Command prior to an investigation being taken on. But I'll hand over to Mr. Walton to run through that. And there's an existing set of standing operating procedures which should be abided by in that process. But Mr. Walton?
So, Mark Walton, yes, there is a fairly recent history in relation to the management of fixated persons here in New South Wales and Australia. It flows from a program, the Fixated Persons Threat Assessment Centre, that came out of the UK from 2006, and the Australian programs have flowed from a Queensland trial in 2014. Essentially, referrals are made into our terrorism intelligence unit, who assess the information that has been provided. There's a panel that assesses that information, determine the appropriate course as to where that work should be performed. Often with our partnership from New South Wales Health and representation from the Chief Mental Health Officer, police conduct is limited and health options are applied in relation to people that have a mental health history and are unwell, and their fixation is linked to their mental health condition. At times, those cases are referred to local area commands to work through, and the more complex cases are referred to the Fixated Persons Unit, who conduct those investigations.
So is it fair to assume there's a fair process to be followed before the Fixated Persons Unit is used in any particular matter?
Yes.
Can you tell the committee how the Fixated Persons Unit came to be involved in the taking of action against Mr. Kristo Lanka?
That matter, which you're aware, is before the court, so
yeah,
I certainly... Sorry, I need to take care in relation to the detail of that answer, but how did it come to the Fixated Persons Unit?
Yeah, what was the process?
Yes, the history is that in December of 2020, Mr. Shane Brady, the Associate Director of Strategic Security at the Department of Premier and Cabinet, made a referral to the Sydney City Police Area Command, so the command that covers the area, the geography that we're in now. They initiated that report going on the system due to the nature of the alleged harassment of a high office holder, which the Deputy Premier fits the definition of. It was referred through the process to the Terrorism Intelligence Unit. The information was assessed. The panel assessed the nature of the incidents that had been referred, and the Fixated Persons Unit commenced an investigation.
Now, I think you said that there were criteria and a sort of a charter for the activities of the unit. Are those publicly available?
No, they're not.
Are you able to supply them to this committee so we could review them?
I'd certainly take that on notice to provide those standard operating procedures, sir.
Okay. Can you inform the committee whether the Deputy Premier, Mr. Barilaro, or any person in his office sought the involvement of the Fixated Persons Unit in relation to Mr. Lanka's matter?
I have no information to suggest that occurred. There has certainly been contact between the Deputy Premier's office and the investigators, which is to be expected in the course of an investigation, in the course of a victim and investigator contact.
All right. Well, if you could take my question on notice and give a completer answer, that would be good. My next Next question is whether Mr. Barilaro or any person in his office made a complaint to police about Mr. Lanka and his activities, or did the police act of their own accord in this matter?
The referral, as I've outlined, initially came from Mr. Brady, and the investigation commenced from that point.
Right. So does that mean the police acted of their own accord?
Well, I think it's more fairer to say that Mr. Barilaro's office or someone provided concerns or allegations that were then referred via Mr. Brady in the first instance.
Okay, and I think I've asked you to see if you could take on notice whether you could supply the committee a copy of the sort of criteria used by the unit, its sort of charter of activities.
Yes.
Thank you. I think my time's expired.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Yeah, thank you all for attending this afternoon and the work you've been doing. Mr. Walton, this might be appropriately addressed by you. Can you tell us what the criteria is for a matter being investigated by the Fixated Persons Unit? I know you gave some answers to Mr. Searle, but can you tell us what the criteria are?
I haven't got the SOPs in front of me, so I'd have to sort of collectively give you my recollection of that. As I said, there is a process that vets and determines what cases are done by the Fixated Persons Unit. Essentially, it does hang on that someone's fixated, there's ongoing harassment, and typically they are high office holders, or there's a criteria that allows us in circumstances to determine someone who has been, I suppose, overwhelmingly harassed by someone for the unit to undertake that investigation. Typically, they're more complex matters that require significant evidence gathering and being able to present that material to the courts.
So it's not just any concern raised by a public figure like an MP or the Deputy Premier. There has to be a very real continuing pattern of behaviour. Is that your understanding?
That's typical. That there's an assessment that it's a serious ongoing issue, and often a threat of violence is a threshold that we move towards.
And indeed, I could assume there would be circumstances where a very serious threat of violence of itself would be sufficient, and you wouldn't need an ongoing series of events if there was a very serious threat of violence. Would that be right?
Indeed, and in the current environment, particularly online, we are seeing a lot of people venting their frustrations, whether it's anti-government, anti-policy, or anti-establishment, and those matters are again being assessed and determined where that investigation is appropriately conducted, given the volume. The bulk of them are being done by local police, and in many instances, when they're engaged by the police, they remove that post. There's a level of contrition and essentially a warning's taken.
So in many cases, even when there's quite serious threats, it's addressed by police approaching the person, making it known that they are being observed, and a caution is given, and that's often how these matters are addressed. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I wouldn't say serious threat. If there was a serious threat, formal action would be taken.
Is it part of the Fixated Persons Unit's role to police the political criticisms of members of Parliament, even quite robust political criticisms of members of Parliament? Is that in any way part of the Fixated Persons Unit's role or parameters?
No.
You see, Ms. Walner, I'm having difficulty understanding how, given the nature of that evidence, that the Fixated Persons Unit was in any way involved with the investigation of Kristo Lanka. It doesn't seem to meet any of those thresholds. And indeed, on one view of it, meets one of the exclusions.
Well, it was assessed as meeting that. It was certainly an ongoing allegations of harassment, and this matter is before the court, Mr. Shoebridge. So I'm concerned that if we start to get into the detail of those allegations, we may be subdued.
I'm really interested in the role of the fixated persons unit, and not indeed the court proceedings. Have you reviewed the decision by the fixated persons unit to become involved in this matter?
I haven't reviewed the decision. I have looked at the material.
And have you satisfied? I'll come back to you in a sec. Have you satisfied yourself, having reviewed that material, that it met the criteria for investigation by the fixated persons unit under the SOPs, the standard operating procedures?
I'd have to take that on notice to clearly benchmark it, but as I sit here, I'm comfortable with the decision for the fixated persons unit's involvement in this matter.
Sorry, Mr. Hudson, you may have wanted to add something, I think. Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. I'd like to clarify something. Mr. Walton was actually on leave, I think, when the gentleman was arrested. I did question the process. I forwarded a memorandum to the acting commander of the Counter-Terrorism and Special Tactics Command, asking him to review what happened. I don't think appropriate processes were properly followed in that assessment. Having said that, I think if the appropriate processes were followed, we would have the same result. I was more concerned about the process that was followed rather than the outcome. I don't think it would have changed the fact that the fixated persons unit would have become involved in the matter. I don't think it would have changed the fact that we would have preferred charges against the gentleman. But because of the sensitivities around this, we are quite strong on the fact that the process has to be followed, and if we identify incidents where that doesn't happen, we will question it and correct it.
Thanks, Mr. Hudson. In what regard did you form a view that incorrect process had been applied in this matter?
Well, my recollection is that the referral that Mr. Walton referred to earlier was not in relation to Kristo. It was in relation to an associate of his. That was under investigation and is currently still under investigation. There had been contact, and that went through the appropriate referral pathways, and the investigation was being conducted by the Fixated Persons Unit, and that involved allegations made by the Deputy Premier. Kristo Lancter's matter came around at the same time that matter was being determined, and because there was a conduit of contact between the Deputy Premier's office and the Fixated Persons Unit, there was some contact made, and I think the Fixated Persons Unit treated it as an escalation of the same incident rather than a separate incident with a separate suspect. And I think, in my opinion, it should have been treated as a separate suspect, go through the same process that we normally do and assessed by the Terrorism Intelligence Unit prior to the Fixated Persons Unit taking that on board as an investigation. As I said before, it would not have changed the outcome. If we had gone down that path, it would have been a matter that would have been investigated by the Fixated Persons Unit. I think it would have been a matter still that would end up before the courts, as it is now. But in my mind, and I know Commissioner Fuller agrees with this and Mr. Walton agrees with this, we have to ensure that the process for jobs coming into that unit are followed. So, as I said, that matter, as Mr. Walton's alluded to, that matter is now before the court, and we will be prosecuting that as we would any other matter.
So, Mr. Hudson, are you saying the Fixated Persons Unit made the decision to charge Mr. Lanka, having wrongly assumed it was part of an escalating pattern of conduct? Is that your evidence?
I think it's the gentleman is linked to a matter they were already investigating, and they saw it as a continuance of the same behaviour rather than an isolated incident. However, individually, as a matter is still under investigation, the initial matter is still under investigation. So Kristo Lanka's matter was more clear cut and action was taken more immediately.
Deputy Commissioner Hudson, you understand the very real concern in the community where people have engaged in robust satire of politicians end up finding themselves charged with criminal offences by police. You would understand the very real concern in the community, and I'll just be clear, it's a concern that I very, very much share. Do you understand the level of concern about this matter?
Totally understand the issue, Mr. Shivich, and there is a line that will ultimately be determined by the court as to whether that line has been crossed or not. That will be a determination by the court.
But in this case, police made a decision to have the Fixated Persons Unit involved, which is effectively there for serious political related crimes. And that seems to have been, you accept now, an error on the part of the New South Wales Police. Is that right?
No, I don't see the Fixated Persons Unit investigating this matter as being a mistake. I consider the pathway that caused them to investigate the matter and the SOPs, standard operating procedures that currently exist to ensure that inappropriate matters are not investigated by that unit. We're not
Mr. Hudson, just on that, as I understand it, and maybe the police commissioner can correct me, the Fixated Persons Unit was established just before the coroner's report into the Lint Cafe siege came out, and at the time it was indicated its activities would be directed towards preventing terrorism and tackling people who were potentially violent. Can you tell the committee, at least roughly, on what basis did Mr. Lanka's activities bring it within the scope of the Fixated Persons Unit? I mean, is the suggestion that his activities were terrorism related?
The Fixated Persons Unit sits under the Counter-Terrorism and Special Tactics Command, Mr. Searle.
That's right.
However, it has a broad remit looking at, as Mr. Walton alluded to earlier, for issues that would come out of a fixated threat assessment process. So there's a number of people involved at different stages, depending upon the nature of the job, including a fixated persons panel, which includes psychologists that can make referrals. But it has a fairly broad remit to investigate matters where it is determined that some form of fixation on an individual or a group or an entity could lead to potential violence.
Sure, but I mean, it's a
terrorist
counter-terrorism command. It obviously would have to be at a very high level to warrant the involvement of that body, wouldn't it?
I think since inception in 2017, the Fixated Persons Unit has investigated over 600 matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think charged over 150 people now. But I can get those more specific details to you. I can take those on notice.
Please do.
But there's a variety of individuals that have been charged by that unit. Their commonality is the fixation, whether it be terrorism, fixated on a politician, fixated on a movie star, which we've had as well. The commonality is the fixation, not necessarily whether it's political, terrorism related, or what else.
All right, in which case is its location in the Counter-Terrorism Command an entirely appropriate one, given, from what you said, the very broad spectrum of operational activities it's dealt with? I mean, where it is now, it looks like it deals with terrorism, counter-terrorism, very serious threats of political violence. And there's been a lot of concern around its use in this case. There's been a former DPP's made comment, lawyers have made comments, not about the activities. I mean, if there's criminal activities, that's one issue, and we're not talking about the proceedings at the moment, but we're just talking about the use of this unit. Do you understand the sort of concerns that have been expressed about the use of the unit in this case?
I totally understand, and as I said, I caused the acting commander of counter-terrorism to review the process in this particular matter. As I've indicated, I don't think it would have changed the outcome. I think the matter, as I understand it, that's currently before the courts, is appropriately investigated by the Fixated Persons Unit and appropriate actions taken, which we are continuing to prosecute. But I can understand the concern that people have raised.
Certainly. And do I understand from your evidence that the concerns about Mr. Lanka were in the nature of fixation rather than in the nature of threats of violence or any kind of political issue?
That's correct.
In which case, again, do you think that perhaps there should be a different unit located outside of counter-terrorism that should deal with matters that don't involve terrorism or terrorism-related issues?
As other fixated units around the world, emanating out of fixated threat assessment centres and fixated threat assessment centre processes, there is a strong link at times with terrorism. Once assessed there's a very strong mechanism of assessment of threat and risk through the Counter-Terrorism Command, which is applied through the Terrorism Intelligence Unit. I don't have the details with me, but not all matters assessed by that unit and referred to that unit, not all investigations are conducted by that unit. As Mr. Walton alluded to earlier, many of those matters are referred to local area commands, police area commands or police districts for investigation, as it is determined through that panel process that investigation better sits within that environment rather than within the counter-terrorism command.
Okay, and your evidence is that you're utterly confident that all of the appropriate processes and filters were used in this particular matter?
I think that the way that the investigation was conducted, came to notice, was reviewed. I reminded the unit through the commander, the acting commander of counter-terrorism, to follow the standing operating procedures, and I think those standing operating procedures are valid and need to be adhered to.
Are you aware whether the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission is looking at the investigation of this matter?
Am I aware if they are? No, I'm not aware if they are.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, some of the criticism has been that essentially Mr. Lanka and his employer were really engaged in political scrutiny of the government, and that the use of the Fixated Persons Unit in this matter has taken on if you like, a political flavour. Can you tell us whether the complaint made by Mr. Barilaro, his office, specifically sought the involvement of the Fixated Persons Unit, or was it just generally a complaint to police?
The initial complaint, the first complaint was made to, as Mr. Walton said, to the City Central Police Area Command, not to the Counter-Terrorism Command.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I might move on from this interesting topic because I think you've taken some questions on notice and you're going to supply us with certain documents that we can have a look at the charter given to the unit.